Thank you for joining me as I begin my examination of the book Not God's Type by Holly Ordway, and in doing so, resume the An Atheist Reads series for another year. Welcome, everyone. Whether this is your first Atheist Reads series that you've watched of mine, or whether you've been with me for a while now, thank you for joining me. I hope that this will be of some interest and of use to you. As always, at the beginning of a new series, I am going to spend a minute or two here at the beginning just reintroducing the format. So if this is all old news to you and you would rather just skip right to the beginning of the actual material in the book, you can go ahead and skip ahead to the time code on your screen right there in the lower third, and you can jump ahead of all of these preliminaries and just get right to the content of the book. Now, for everybody else who is sticking around for the introduction, the reason why I do this, and the reason why I continue to do this, and this is the 19th book that I have done in this format, is because I see folks all the time who are non-believers, who are atheists, who are either interested in having conversations with religious folks or are sort of forced into these conversations because they are in social groups or families that are, religious and are trying to constantly convert them or save them or move them along on their spiritual journey that they are assumed to be on. Many of these folks are well-meaning, but they present these arguments and these claims and often these books, these apologetics books, that they place in the hands of their atheist or non-believing loved one or friend or whatever. And as an atheist, it can sometimes be difficult to know how to respond to that, to know what to do with that. I know in my own experience, when I was a younger person, I was given a copy of Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ, and I read it, and there was just something about it that didn't persuade me. I didn't agree with it. I didn't think that the things it was saying were right, were true. I was not convinced by the arguments or by the evidence that was being offered, but I couldn't articulate exactly what it was. And it wasn't until many years later when I read the book a second time, for the first An Atheist Reads series, after I had been exposed to some other atheists making arguments and to some other debates between atheists and Christians, that I was able to articulate my own feelings and my own thoughts as to why I didn't agree with it and why I thought what I believed was more reasonable than what the author was saying. And I find that that's very helpful, to hear someone else's point of view. So if you are watching this and you are an atheist and you have had one of these apologetics books placed in your hands by a well-meaning friend or relative, and you've paged through it and you've read some of it and you don't agree with it, but you're not quite sure exactly what it is you don't agree with, or you can't really articulate precisely what it is that you think is wrong with it, hopefully this series and other series like this one will be of use to you, because I know that hearing other atheists talk about their own points of view, their own responses to these arguments, was a great help to me. So that is the main reason why I do this. A secondary reason is that I really sincerely believe that it's very important to inform yourself about the opinions and the positions of people who disagree with you. I'm an atheist. I'm not a Christian, but for the last several years, I have done these series on my channel every year, reading and responding to books written by Christians, usually for, or at least presumably for, a Christian audience, because I think that's the best source for learning what Christians, what Christian apologists, what Christian evangelists think, and what their arguments are, what their positions are, how they view atheists, how they talk to each other about atheists. I think it's very important if we're going to be responding to these folks, if we're going to be advocating for an equal place at the table for non-Christians, and particularly, in my case, for atheists or non-believers of any religion, I think it's important to know what those folks are saying, because they have a lot of influence in our culture. They have a very loud microphone that they get to speak into. And if we're going to counter what they have to say, or be able to speak up for ourselves in an intelligent and articulate way, we're going to have to be informed about what they're saying. So that's very important too. So that's another reason why I do this, just in general. Now, the book that I have chosen for the first An Atheist Read series of this year is titled Not God's Type. It is written by Holly Ordway. And actually, Professor Ordway has written 2 books with this title, and you can tell them apart by their subtitles. The first version of this book was published in 2010, and it was titled, or is titled, it's still available, Not God's Type, subtitle, A Rational Academic Finds a Radical Faith. Then the second version of the book was published in 2014, and it is titled Not God's Type, An Atheist Academic Lays Down Her Arms. And they are different books. They are not completely different. There's a lot of overlap. They're not exactly first edition, second edition. There are some significant differences, but they are essentially the same book. It's almost as if the second is an extensive rewrite of the first. And I will be devoting this series to the second version of the book, Not God's Type, An Atheist Academic Lays Down Her Arms. That will be the version I will be reading and responding to in this series. And as has been my custom for the last few years, I will be reading and citing the Kindle version of the book, for those of you who wish to follow along. Now, the author is Holly Ordway. She is a professor of English, and she is the director of the MA in Apologetics at Houston Baptist University. She specializes in literary apologetics with academic work focusing on C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Charles Williams, and her current project is a critical study of the works of Tolkien. Now, Ordway is different from the other authors whose work I have examined in this format in the past. For one, her educational background, like mine, is in English. She is not a philosopher or a would-be philosopher, as many of the past authors I have examined have been. She is not a theologian or a would-be theologian, as many of the authors I have examined in the past have been. She is a student and a teacher of English and of English literature. And unlike every other author that I have studied in past An Atheist Reads series, she's a woman. This is the first book that I have done in this series that is written by a woman. In fact, every book that I will be examining in 2017 as part of An Atheist Reads is going to be written by a woman. This is a very intentional project on my part. It is my intention to sort of address an inequality in my responses to apologetics books. In the past, I have focused exclusively on apologetics books written by men, and I want to correct that. And I will say, at least partially in my own defense, it is very difficult to find apologetics books written by women. Christian apologetics is a field that is overwhelmingly dominated by men. So it takes a little bit of searching to find not only Christian books or Christian apologetics books that are written by woman authors, but also that are suitable for the kind of series and the kind of responses that I do in these videos. So I have found some. Just as in 2016, here in 2017, there will be a total of 4 An Atheist Reads series produced this year, this being the first. And I am interested to see, as I examine these 4 different works by these 4 different authors, if there are any differences in approach or style as compared to the work that I have reviewed in the past that was written exclusively by men. Not God's Type, An Atheist Academic Lays Down Her Arms contains 27 chapters. Each video in this series will cover 3 or 4 of those chapters. This series will consist of a total of 8 videos when it's complete, and this video that you're watching right now will cover chapters 1, 2, and 3 of Not God's Type. Before I start with chapter 1, I want to share this quote from Ordway's preface to the book. Quote, "We need an appreciation of the way reason and imagination interact, and the way that meaning is wrestled with and formed over the long term. Without such an understanding, apologists can easily become frustrated when providing a compelling argument. Decisively refuting an objection or providing scriptural backup doesn't lead to an immediate conversion. A well-intentioned desire to share the truth can turn into arrogant impatience. Can't you see how obviously wrong you are? Your objections are invalid. Get with the program and be converted already." Well, there's a lot there that I agree with. Looking from the atheist side of things, much of what Ordway says there sounds very familiar to my fellow atheists watching this video who have engaged with religious folks in discussions about evolution or the historicity of the Bible. How often have you grown impatient with the other person and thought, this is so obvious, this makes perfect sense, there's evidence for this, I'm not just making this up, there is a scientific consensus about these things that I'm saying. Why don't they get it? And I think part of the reason that we fail to get through to religious folks is the same as what Ordway describes when talking about the failure of Christian apologists to get through to non-Christian folks. We often don't appreciate the importance of imagination alongside reason. We value the intellect and we value logic, but in valuing these things, we sometimes unintentionally cut them off from imagination and emotion. And in doing so, we not only warp them into something other than what they are, we rob them of a great deal of their power. Logic, reason, intellect, these things are priceless. They are precious things. We are very fortunate to have them. They allow us to understand the world around us. But they aren't superior to the emotion or the imagination, and they didn't evolve to operate in the absence of emotion or imagination. They should work together to inform each other, to rein each other in, to provide checks and balances, and also to allow us to have a more complete understanding of our experiences. And while there are certainly questions that demand a dispassionate, logical answer rather than an emotional one, I would no more recommend that someone rely totally on their reason than I would that someone rely totally on their emotions. In that same way, I wouldn't expect arguments designed to appeal solely to the rational intellect to be persuasive to everyone who heard them, just as I wouldn't expect arguments designed to appeal solely to the emotions to be persuasive to everyone. We don't think that way. We judge what is true and what is false and what makes sense to us and what doesn't on a variety of factors, and expecting others to agree with us simply because we've presented a case which is persuasive to us or which we consider logically sound and compelling is simply not enough. Just as Ordway cautions her presumably Christian readers against an impatient, just convert already mindset, I think that I and my fellow atheists would be well served to avoid a similar just deconvert already approach to our conversations with religious folks. Treating other people with respect and acknowledging the validity of their experiences, despite how we may disagree about the nature of some of those experiences, is crucial if we want to have amiable and or constructive disagreements, and also if we want to, live alongside each other in a pluralistic society, if that's important to you. So, okay. Ordway acknowledges the shortcomings that are very common to the Christian approach to apologetics. I'm happy to acknowledge the same from the atheist side when we engage with religious folks, so that's a good way to begin. Let's see how long it lasts. Let's begin with Chapter 1, A Glorious Defeat. Ordway begins the chapter by describing some of the changes that she experienced upon converting from atheism to Christianity. Quote, "It was exciting to learn more about theology and doctrine. Go figure, I'm an academic, but assimilating this new knowledge into my daily life was much harder. I had to learn how to pray and how to be part of a community with these strange and slightly scary people called Christians. I had to reevaluate my position as a liberal feminist. Much of what I had believed turned out to be false, grounded as it was in an incomplete and distorted understanding of what it means to be human and female. I had to discover how to be a Christian witness in a hostile environment as an English professor at a secular community college." I hope as the book goes on that Ordway shares what beliefs she found to be false that convinced her to reevaluate her feminism. I might have a guess or two at this point, but we'll just wait and see. I also hope that she elaborates on the hostile environment she encountered at her secular community college. I would expect many workplaces would begin to feel hostile to you if you insisted on proselytizing to your coworkers at work. It's just not very professional behavior. And finally, I can't help but notice her description of Christians as strange and slightly scary, and relate it to the other times I've heard apologists or evangelists talk this way. It's a kind of false self-deprecation. A Christian will say something like, I didn't want to become a Christian. Christians were weird. Or when I first got saved, I didn't know how to act around these strange Christians. And at first it sounds like they're being self-effacing or maybe even a little critical of certain aspects of Christian culture. But then it turns out they're just paying themselves and their religion a compliment, because once they adjusted, they realized how awesome Christians actually are. Ordway then describes how she realized that even though she'd thought of herself as a fairly good person, she fell infinitely short of God's standard of good, and that even though she didn't deserve it, God loved her anyway, completely and unreservedly. If alongside their declarations of love, a person is constantly reminding you of your unworthiness and their ultimate superiority, can you call that complete and unreserved love? Actually, can you call that love? Anyway, next, Ordway describes her experience at the cross, and by this she means metaphorically, experiencing God's healing grace. She says that while she was preoccupied with the resurrection prior to her conversion, since becoming a Christian, she has come to understand the cross in more spiritual terms. She says, quote, "Could God's grace reach and heal the hidden wounds of my heart? In my journey to Christian faith, I had focused on the resurrection, but after my baptism, that sacramental entry into the death and resurrection of Christ, I began to discover that the cross is the fount of healing and transforming grace, not just part of the historical events of Jesus' passion and death, but the place where the incarnate God took all the black weight of human misery and broke its power for everyone, for me. The cross, to put it bluntly, is where all the stops." Well, putting it bluntly would be to actually spell out the entire word shit, rather than censoring it in your own book to spare the tender sensibilities of your Christian readers. Maybe just rephrasing to leave out the half-hearted profanity altogether would have been a better choice there. Or do Christian readers appreciate pretended edginess? If they do, then they have something in common with the audiences of some of the more popular YouTube atheists. That and clueless anti-feminism. Maybe they could, get together on that. Anyway, Ordway winds up this first chapter and her summary of her story to come this way, quote, "So then, this is the account of a glorious defeat, an unsought but desperately needed relinquishing of my cherished independence, an unconditional surrender in which I was brought from death to life, from trying to live without God to being led fully into his body, the church. And as I first knew Christ as my sovereign Lord, this is also a sketch of how I later grew to love him as my Savior. Lastly, this is not, at the heart of it, a story of what I was clever enough to do, but rather of what I was weak enough to have done to me and for me. It is an account of God's work, a tale of grace acting in and through human beings, but always issuing from him and leading back to him. And it is the story of my being brought home." Again, there's a lot there that sounds very familiar to me, having read quite a few Christian apologetics books in the past. The surrender of the self to God, the perception of the self as being weak and inadequate and needing God's intervention to be made whole and worthy. This vision of Christ as a benevolent authoritarian. This book will be somewhat different from others I've examined for the reasons I mentioned earlier, and also because this is first and foremost a memoir. There is a lot of apologetic stuff in here, but it's being told through Holly Ordway's own life story, and the two are very much interconnected. I am going to be responding to her account from my atheist perspective as always. I'm going to challenge it when I feel that such a challenge is necessary and productive, and of course I'm going to do my best to counter any of her factually questionable claims that are made, but I want to make it clear both for the understanding of you, the viewer, and also to hold myself accountable, that my intention here is not to roast Holly Ordway, not to demean her or invalidate her experience, or at least her memory or her conception of her experience. When she writes at the end of that quote that she has been brought home, I believe her, and I accept her sincerity, and I respect how important that is to her. And I don't see it as my job in this series to make her look foolish for feeling how she feels or for having had the experiences that she's had. My job is to read this, attempt to understand it, and offer a response to it from my perspective as someone with a worldview that is different and very often contrary to that of Ordway. And hopefully that response will be of interest and of use to you folks who are watching, and hopefully I can offer it without disrespecting the personal experiences of the author too much, at least no more than necessary. I've never done anything quite like this before, so please do bear with me as we move along and I try to strike this balance, okay? Now let's move on to chapter 2, which is titled The Dark Wood. Ordway explains that the term atheist is derived from the Greek atheos, meaning literally without God. I've never heard that. Have you ever heard that before? I've never heard that before. Anyway, quote, that is how I would have described myself at 31 years old, nearly the same age as Dante in The Dark Wood. I was an atheist college professor, and I delighted in thinking of myself that way. I got a kick out of being an unbeliever. It was fun to consider myself superior to the unenlightened, superstitious masses and to make snide comments about Christians. It's kind of a twist on one of the classic Christian apologist tropes, isn't it? Instead of talking about a time that she encountered an atheist college professor, she's telling us about how when she was the atheist college professor. There are plenty of atheists who delight in denigrating religious people, mocking them for their credulity and ignorance and perceived lack of intelligence. There are plenty of atheists who take our lack of religious belief as evidence of our intellectual and moral superiority. There is no question about that. I've been one of those atheists. From time to time, I still am one of those atheists, despite my best efforts to guard against it. Unfortunately, by describing her past atheist self in those terms, Ordway is only confirming the perception many of her Christian readers already have about atheists, that we're all caustic, condescending smartasses who get off on bullying religious folks. And again, there are plenty of atheists who are exactly that. And there are communities of atheists, particularly online, that encourage and reward that kind of behavior. But those atheists do not speak for all atheists, and the atheist community as a whole should not be defined by those people or those communities. But when someone writing for a Christian audience says, I used to be an atheist and I was a jerk who felt superior to religious folks and enjoyed insulting them, and that's all they say in reference to atheism, then they're reinforcing the view that all atheists are like that, and that religious folks, particularly Christians, are being systematically victimized and abused by atheists. Ordway goes on to liken her life as an atheist to how her vision was before she got her eyeglasses, just as she didn't realize how much she really needed her glasses until she got them and saw how much more there was to see. As an atheist, she didn't realize that she needed God, but now as a Christian, she realizes how much more there is to see. Quote, my problem could not be solved by hearing a preacher assert that Jesus loved me and wanted to save me. I didn't believe in God to begin with, and I assumed that the Bible was a collection of folk tales and myths, like the stories I'd read of Zeus and Thor, Cinderella, and Sleeping Beauty, only not so interesting. Why should I bother to read the Bible, much less take seriously what it said about this Jesus? I certainly didn't think an imaginary God could have a real son. Since I didn't believe that I had an immortal soul, I wasn't in the least interested in its purported destination after I died. No God, no afterlife, no hell, no reason to discuss the matter further. And here again, I find Ordway reinforcing stereotypes about atheists. It's true that many atheists are dismissive and disdainful of the Bible, but it's also true that many atheists have not only read the Bible, but studied it very seriously from many different perspectives, as literature, as mythology, as history, or perhaps as pseudo-history. And while there are atheists who don't see any reason to read the Bible, I don't know many who would actively discourage people from reading it. And in fact, many atheists consider reading the Bible to be a good way to begin a journey away from Christianity, provided the reading is a critical one. And while there are certainly atheists who have no interest in talking about religion, some for reasons like those Ordway describes, as most of you watching this video are aware, there are many, many atheists who do see a reason to discuss the matter further and comment and argue about religion all the time. So much so that it's not at all uncommon for Christians to attempt to silence such atheists by asking, if you don't believe in God, why do you talk about him so much? Quote, I thought faith was by definition irrational, that it meant believing some assertion to be true for no reason. It had never occurred to me that there could be a path to faith in God involving reason, or that there might be evidence for the claims of Christianity. Believing something irrational on demand to get a prize. That is what the evangelical invitation to accept Jesus and get eternal life in heaven sounded like to me. If there is evidence for Christianity, I would love to hear about it. I sincerely mean that. I've said that in many of my past Atheist Read series when this subject has been brought up by the authors. If you have evidence for the truth of the claims of Christianity, I really want to see it. I'm sincerely very interested. Given what she's had to say so far, I suspect that the evidence which convinced Ordway is not unlike the evidence we have seen in past books reviewed in this series, evidence that is only compelling once you have accepted a definition of evidence that allows for things that would not qualify as evidence in a scientific investigation. But maybe I'm wrong. Also, while believe something irrational on demand to get a prize is a pretty good basic description of the offer presented by Christianity, I think it gives the God of the Bible too much credit, personally. The offer in most forms of Christianity with which I am familiar is more like believe several irrational and or demonstrably false things and love and worship an all-powerful being on demand to avoid everlasting punishment, which you deserve merely for having been born. It's a little wordier than the believe and get a prize, but I think it's a bit more accurate as far as how it represents the offer that is being made. Quote, if I had inquired, I would have found the Bible was nothing like I thought it was. I would have encountered St. Paul's forthright declaration that Christianity is based on the historical, witnessed events of Christ's death and resurrection. I would have found that the Church's 2,000-year history did not conform to my image of the Christian faith as a self-serving, politically useful fiction. But I thought I knew exactly what faith was, and so I declined to look further. I had built myself a fortress of atheism, secure against any attack by irrational faith, and I lived in it alone. So, Paul declares that Christianity is based on historical evidence. But is that declaration evidence? Or is it merely the claim that evidence exists or used to exist? Because the claim that evidence exists is not evidence. If I say to you, the town where I live was founded 1,000 years ago by a 6-foot-tall talking purple cat, you're probably not going to believe me. If I say to you, the town where I live was founded 1,000 years ago by a 6-foot-tall talking purple cat, and there is good historical evidence to establish this, you're still probably not going to believe me unless I can show you the actual evidence. Paul's declaration means nothing by itself. As far as I have ever learned, we do not have the actual evidence to which Paul is referring, to which Paul says that Christianity is based on. And if we don't have the actual evidence, it doesn't matter what Paul declared. And she ends that quote and this chapter with the implication that life as an atheist is isolating, that atheists are lonely and alienated from society because of their lack of religious faith. As with the other stereotypes about atheists she has encouraged her readers to accept, this is also extremely misleading. I take Ordway at her word when she says that she lived alone in her fortress of atheism, but she's also presenting this loneliness to her Christian readers as a representative example of atheists as a group, as something that is typical of atheists and that is perhaps even due to their atheism. And she goes into more detail in the next chapter, so let's just get to that. Chapter 3, Alone in the Fortress of Atheism. Ordway describes life inside her atheist fortress as good. She found her worldview satisfactory. She thought that she could make sense of the world. She was content with what she believed. What did she believe? Quote, I held that I was the product of blind chance working over millions of years, a member of a species that happened to be more intelligent than other mammals but was not unique. I thought I was a social creature because that was how humans evolved. The language that I delighted in using was just a tool that humans had developed along the way. Notice how her use of language subtly diminishes all of these things to which she's referring. Humans are social creatures because we evolved that way, implying the lack of a greater purpose that we presumably would wish to be there. Language is just a tool. Our species just happened to be more intelligent than others, and we're not unique. And personally, I don't see how any of those things is rendered less remarkable because it's the result of natural rather than divine forces. Whether our intelligence and consciousness and social natures and ability to use language developed as a result of natural processes or were created by some pre-existing intelligence, they are awesome in the most sincere sense of that word. I have never understood why so many religious folks seem so determined to denigrate humanity, life in general, and even the universe itself by insisting that without their God, these things would be the products of mere natural processes and would not be worthy of the value and awe that they inspire in us. Ordway goes on, quote, if I had been consistent, I would have embraced the theories of literary criticism that treated stories and poems as language games with no meaning outside the text, or that pronounced language itself to be self-contradictory and meaningless. But I didn't. One of the reasons I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the little-regarded genre of fantasy was that I wanted to avoid that kind of literary theory and stick to a more traditional, meaning-based interpretation of the books. Even though in doing so I was contradicting the principles that undergirded my atheism, I treated art, music, and literature as if they had real meaning. I studiously avoided thinking through why I did this. Well, perhaps Ordway did this because, at least at the time, she regarded such theories as useless and absurd. And if that was the case, I agree with her. At least I agree with then her. Of what use is it to point out that stories and poems have no meaning outside the text when the text itself has no inherent meaning? Letters in an alphabet are not the same as, say, elementary particles. They don't have intrinsic, immutable properties. The letter A has certain properties and performs certain functions in our language, not because A has any intrinsic properties, but because we have selected it as a symbol that represents various sounds, which can then be combined with other symbols to form words to symbolize things or ideas, which can then in turn be combined together to express complex thoughts. But it all works the way it does because we who use that alphabet and speak those languages have agreed with each other as a community that that's how it works. Art and literature do have real meaning, the meaning they have to us, both as individuals and collectively as cultures. The only meaning stories or poems have, even the most basic literal meaning derived from a plain reading of the text, is what we impart to them. And it is in no way inconsistent with atheism to acknowledge that, nor does atheism prevent us from deriving meaning beyond that found in a literal plain reading. Artistic truth, poetic truth, these things are subjective. They can vary from one person to the next. They are not definitive and objective in the way of factual, empirical, or mathematical truths, but that doesn't mean that they aren't real, or useful, or important, and one does not need to assume the existence of any God in order to recognize, think about, or value such artistic or poetic truths. You do not need to view all works of literature as flat, literal texts in order for your literary criticism to be consistent with your atheism. That is absurd and a gross misunderstanding of not only atheism, but literature and art in general. And it is disappointing and disconcerting to find such nonsense coming from a professor of literature. The belief that provided the foundation for all her views, Ordway says, was that there was no God and therefore there was no ultimate meaning. Ordway describes how, as a student in high school, she struggled with the conflict between her belief in a life that had no meaning and her sense that life was worth living and that it was important to be a good person. And then she has this to say, quote, "Atheism, when consistently lived out, leads to self-deception or despair. Self-constructed meaning is only a stopgap. It is real, only in the sense that a stage set of the Elsinore Castle is a real place. One can suspend disbelief while Hamlet is being performed, but at some point the curtain falls and one must leave the theater. What's to be done when helping others, doing good work, and having friends are recognized as paint and canvas and trick lighting?" Ordway seems to be implying a false dichotomy here. Either there is ultimate meaning, or there is self-constructed meaning, as in meaning we construct ourselves as individuals. But while I believe that all meaning ultimately does come from ourselves, most of it doesn't come from ourselves as individuals, but from us, from our society, from our families, from our communities, from our cultures, the things that we individual members of our species share with each other. Take language, for example. I didn't make up any of the rules of the language I speak. Languages are human constructs, so they are self-constructed in that sense, but they aren't self-constructed in the individual sense. They exist apart from me. They exist independent of my own individual being. We all contribute to the evolution of the languages we use, but no one individual is responsible for constructing English or Spanish or Mandarin or Swahili or Greek or Latin or any other language you could name. And the same is true not just of language, but of culture in general, of morality, and the various ways in which we derive meaning from our lives. The notions that helping others or having friends are good things that enrich our lives are self-constructed at the level of the human species, yes, but not at the level of the individual human. I didn't independently invent the concept of charity to distract myself from how pointless my life is. What a horribly misanthropic thought. Charity, kindness, compassion, friendship, these are things we as a species have learned to value over thousands of years. We cherish and derive meaning from them because they improve our lives, and not just our individual lives, but our shared lives as families, friends, and communities. It isn't suspending disbelief. It's living in a way that enables strong, vibrant, resilient societies based on reciprocity and acceptance and respect. It's not a performance. It's practicing and passing on behaviors that make life healthier and more fulfilling for all of us. And again, it is deeply disappointing to see a person who has dedicated her professional life to the study and the teaching of literature, comparing helping others and doing good work and having friends to the facade of a stage set. But that's not the most offensive thought expressed in that quote. That dubious distinction goes to the first sentence, which I remind you is, atheism, when consistently lived out, leads to self-deception and despair. Are there atheists who have fallen into the trap of self-deception? Of course. Are there atheists who have felt despair at the thought of a godless universe and inevitable and permanent death? Undoubtedly. But are self-deception and despair necessary and unavoidable consequences of atheism consistently lived out, whatever that means? No, of course not. Atheists are not perfect people. Atheist communities have their fair share of problems, many of which we need to be much better at addressing. Atheists have no right, by virtue of our atheism, to claim superior intelligence or morality or insight for ourselves. A great many atheists believe a great many foolish things and cause great harm to the world by living out those foolish beliefs. But there is nothing about the atheist position, the simple state of not believing in the existence of gods, that requires self-deception or leads inevitably to despair. For Professor Ordway to make this claim to her Christian readers, readers who will be all the more credulous in accepting it due to her status as a former atheist, is irresponsible and offensive. Ordway has previously described the ways in which Christian methods of reaching out to non-believers can be inadequate or off-putting. And it's a shame that she herself has failed to grasp the importance of modeling for her Christian readers a basic respect for non-believers, which would include not perpetuating stereotypes and reinforcing misconceptions and outright lies about what atheism is, how it works, and what requirements it imposes on people who hold the position. And here's some more of Ordway's. Man, I am just misspeaking all over the place. Here's some more of Ordway missing the point. Quote, "All I had to do was look at myself and the people around me to recognize that anger, jealousy, insecurity, envy, contempt, selfishness, fear, and greed were deeply rooted in the soil of being human. I knew the difference between imagination and wishful thinking. Atheism might be true, but pretending it was a humanitarian cause offered no solution to my problems. Anger, jealousy, insecurity, envy, contempt, selfishness, fear, and greed, these things are deeply rooted in the soil of being human." I agree with Professor Ordway on this. But so are love, joy, forgiveness, respect, camaraderie, charity, courage, generosity. And this is a common tactic of apologists and evangelists. Present humanity in the darkest light possible. Focus on the worst aspects of human nature as though they account for the whole, as though the better parts of ourselves don't belong to us. I've said before, one of the guiding principles of apologetics is that God gets the credit and we get the blame. Also, one need not imagine that atheism is a humanitarian cause in order to value things like helping others and doing good work. That's what humanism is for. Atheism is a lack of belief regarding a single proposition. It isn't a humanitarian cause. But that doesn't mean that atheists can't be humanitarians. In fact, it doesn't mean that atheists shouldn't be humanitarians, or that atheism prevents those who hold that position from caring about others or working for the betterment of their fellow people and the world in general. Atheism does not prevent people from caring about others, and it does not absolve people of not caring about others. Ordway describes how she tried to derive meaning from other things, for instance, her work as a teacher. But this didn't work either. She lost patience with her students, she was unreliable to her fellow teachers, and eventually she became aware that she was turning into a terrible person. She found some measure of salvation by taking up fencing. She began saber fencing in college, and the sport became a refuge for her. It brought out her courage and toughness, and excelling as a woman in what was predominantly a man's sport gave her a feeling of pride. She began to rely on her pride, not only in her fencing, but in her intellectual abilities, as a way of managing the despair she felt over the ultimate meaninglessness of life. Eventually, she embraced that meaninglessness and began to take pride in her willingness to face the darkness which she thought Christians refused to face by clinging to their beliefs. But her pride fed her contempt for others, and this contempt sometimes erupted in fits of anger, as during an incident when she broke her saber on the face mask of an opponent. She says, quote, "My atheism was eating into my heart like acid. On 9/11, I was genuinely shocked by that vicious destruction of innocent life, until I began to rationalize myself out of my emotional reaction. What did these people matter to me? Weren't thousands killed every year in automobile accidents? Why should I grieve for strangers? It worked. I stopped caring." Now, I don't want to invalidate Ordway's experience here. She says that she felt genuine despair, and she connects that despair with her atheism, and that's fine. I don't object to that. I can't object to that. She felt how she felt. But then, from her experience, she extrapolates a concept of atheism as a whole. She relates the hopelessness she felt back then to her atheism. Therefore, atheism must lead inevitably to hopelessness. She responded to the tragedy of the 9/11 attacks by rationalizing away her shock and grief and numbing herself to it. Therefore, atheism must necessarily compel people to respond coldly to the sufferings of others. It's very poor reasoning, to say the least. Well, we're nearing the end of this chapter, so here is one final quote. Quote, "What I didn't realize at the time was how inconsistent I was. I could not have explained the source of my own rationality, nor of my conviction that there were such things as truth, beauty, and goodness. I used the language of morality, even as I argued that the source of all morality did not exist. Though I felt comfortable being the final arbiter of what was good enough in terms of my own behavior, I was sure that the words good and evil referred to real things, and that I ought to strive for the good, even if it didn't benefit me personally." More well-trodden territory here. Atheists must borrow the language of Christians in order to think about truth, beauty, morality, etc. I've heard this many, many times before. Christians like Ordway simply claim vast areas of human thought and experience as their exclusive domain, and then try to convince others that their faith and those concepts are inextricably linked. It's a cheat. That's all it is. And the irony of Professor Ordway resorting to such tactics is that she has previously characterized some of humanity's noblest qualities, helping others, doing good works, friendship, as stage dressing meant to distract us from an uncomfortable truth. And yet here she is, employing the same obvious misdirections as every other hack apologist, hoping her readers won't be able to see through the smoke and mirrors. Well, that is it for Chapter 3, and that is it for this video. I will be back in the next video in this series to continue my response to Not God's Type. I will be covering Chapter 4, The Invisible Lamp, Chapter 5, The Pen and the Sword, and Chapter 6, Winter and Spring. So Chapters 4 through 6 in the next video. That's it for this video. I want to thank you folks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found this useful. I'm glad to be back doing this for another year. I hope it continues to be of interest and of use to you. If this is of interest and of use to you, please do like and share this video and subscribe to my channel if you're not subbed already. And also, please do consider helping me to make more videos like this one by supporting this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron of this channel, and it really helps me out, especially in regards to these videos. And I've just recently revamped the rewards section of my Patreon campaign, so those of you who are particularly interested in the An Atheist Read series should probably know that starting with this video, I will be posting my original notes, my scripts essentially, for the An Atheist Read series to my Patreon campaign, to my Patreon page, and those will only be viewable to patrons who have donated at a level of $10 a month or more. So if you are interested in these videos, and of course if you can afford to pledge at such an amount, you can have a look at my original notes for the An Atheist Reads series. So thank you all so much for watching. Thank you for finding some use in this. If you have anything to say, like, dislike, agree, disagree, whatever you have to say, provided, of course, that it is constructive in nature, please leave a comment on this video and let me know. I would love to hear from you. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.